Montana Territory. Autumn of 1881, the air smelled like pine and dust, and the wind carried the sounds of fiddle music down from the ridge where the harvest dance was in full swing. Georgia Zeller sat alone at a wooden bench near the edge of the lantern-lit clearing, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, back pinned straight like she had been taught on her mother's porch 2 lifetimes ago in Ohio. The other women swirled in gingham and lace, laughter dancing as freely as the hems of their skirts. Georgia didn't move. She didn't smile. She just stared. She had not come to dance. She had come because the widow Jenkins insisted, and because her 11-year-old daughter, Grace, had pleaded with her to stop living like a ghost. But mostly, she had come because it had been 3 years since her husband left and never came back. 3 years since the war in her heart had started, quiet and cruel. She had not come expecting change. And then he appeared, bootsteps on dry leaves, a shadow cutting across the lantern glow. A tall man in a clean white shirt tucked into dark trousers, a deep brown duster pushed behind a holstered Colt. He had the kind of face that belonged to old paintings, strong jaw, sharp cheekbones, sun-worn skin. His hat was tilted back just enough to show dark hair and eyes that held no mockery, no pity, just steadiness. "Evenin'," he said. "You waiting on someone?" Georgia looked up, startled. "No," he nodded once, then looked out over the crowd. Lot of noise for folks who work sunup to sundown. She didn't answer. Then he turned to her again, his voice lower. "One song with me could change your life." She blinked. "What?" "You heard me." She studied him. "You always go around saying things like that?" "No," he said, lifting a brow. "Only when I mean it." She let out a breath that could have been a laugh but wasn't. "You do not even know me." "Name's Callum Zade," he said, reaching his hand out. "I was raised near Helena. I work cattle up near the Blackfoot River. And I know you have been sitting here for over an hour in a dress too fine to waste." Georgia hesitated. Then she placed her hand in his. He pulled her gently to her feet, folding her into the music like he had been waiting for her all night. She wasn't a practiced dancer, but his hand was warm on her back and his steps were slow, patient. She could smell pine soap and saddle leather on him. His touch was steady, kind. He did not ask questions. After 2 songs, she pulled back. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded, still holding her hand. "You have a daughter," he said, her jaw tensed. "How do you know that?" "Little girl with blonde braids asked me earlier if I'd seen her mother," Callum said. "Said her name was Georgia and she forgot how to smile." Georgia's throat tightened. "Grace. She is a sweet kid. Told me your favorite flower was white lilac. She talks too much. She just misses you." Georgia looked away. Callum gently let go of her hand. "Come walk with me." She paused, then nodded. They wandered away from the clearing, past the lanterns, into the darker edge of the woods where the stars stretched wide and the wind was softer. The sounds of laughter faded behind them. Callum kept his hands loose at his sides. "I lost my brother in the war," he said after a while. "I was 16. After that, my father drank himself into the ground and my mother followed him not long after. I worked cattle to stay ahead of the dark." Georgia looked at him. "I lost my husband in the war, except he came back first. Left again 2 months later, never said why. Just disappeared." Callum nodded. "Some men lose themselves out there, never find their way home. I waited. For 2 years, then I stopped." He glanced at her. "And tonight, she said, "I needed to remember I was still alive." "I think you are," he said. "More than you know." She stopped walking and turned to him. "You do not even know me. I have eyes. I see a woman trying her best for her daughter. I see someone who has not had a reason to hope in a long time. And I see someone who still said yes when a stranger asked her to dance." Georgia swallowed. "You really think one song could change a life?" "I think it already did." She stared at him. something soft warming her chest. "You are very sure of yourself. I am sure of you." She looked down, then back up. "You want to meet Grace? I would like that." They walked back toward the firelight. Grace was sitting on a stump, swinging her legs and eating a slice of pie, cheeks smudged with berry. She looked up and grinned when she saw her mother. "Mama, you danced," Georgia smiled for the first time in days. "I did." Grace's eyes shifted to Callum. "Is this your cowboy?" Callum crouched beside her. "Name's Callum Zade." "I hear you like pie." "I like lilacs better," Grace said, mouth full. He grinned. "Good to know." Georgia shook her head. "Grace, that is not polite." "It is all right," Callum said, standing. "She is honest, that matters." Grace tilted her head. "You gonna come back?" Callum looked at Georgia. "That depends." Georgia met his gaze. Her voice was soft. "I would not mind," he smiled, slow and real. "Then I will." And under the stars, with music still drifting on the breeze and her daughter by her side, Georgia felt something shift, something open. Maybe just one song really could start something new. The early morning after the dance came cold and pale, the kind of quiet that settled deep into the bones. A thin crust of frost clung to the porch railings outside the Zeller homestead, and inside, the stove hissed low beneath a kettle just beginning to hum. Georgia stood at the small window above the washbasin, sleeves rolled, hands idle in a basin of lukewarm water. She hadn't spoken much on the ride home. Grace had dozed in the wagon beside her, arms curled around a basket of leftover pie. Now, with the sun barely lifting above the ridge, she watched the last of the mist slink off the pasture where the neighbors' cattle grazed. Her own land was quiet, just a few hens scratching under the lean-to, and the garden long gone to seed. The silence pressed at her differently this morning. Not heavier, not lighter, just changed. Behind her came the creak of a floorboard, then small feet padding across the plank floor. "You're up early," Georgia said without turning. Grace climbed onto the bench beside the table, dragging the quilt from her shoulders. "You think he'll really come back?" Georgia dried her hands slowly. "I don't know." Grace frowned at the table. "He said he would. Sometimes people mean to, and life gets in the way. But he looked like someone who keeps promises." Georgia opened the stove door, fed in a few small logs. "It's not about looks." Grace blinked at her. "Then what's it about?" Georgia didn't answer right away. She lifted the kettle, poured water into the tin pot of coffee grounds, and set it back on the heat. The scent of it rose into the room, sharp and grounding. "It's about time," she said finally, "and how people use it." That afternoon, Georgia took Grace into town with her. She needed to trade eggs and pick up flour. The general store sat just off the main road, its porch worn smooth by years of boots and wagon wheels. Inside, the shelves leaned under sacks of sugar, bolts of calico, and jars of penny candy. Georgia kept her voice low with Mr. Cal, exchanging goods while Grace hovered near the baskets of dried apples. When they stepped outside again, the sky was the color of pewter, and a few dry leaves scudded along the street. Georgia adjusted the scarf at her throat, her eyes catching on a figure just past the post office. Callum stood beside his horse, reins loose in his hand, talking to an older man with a bandaged wrist. The wind tugged at his coat. Georgia paused. He saw her then. He said something to the man, then stepped away, walking toward her with the same even pace he'd had the night before. "You trade for flour?" he asked, nodding at the sack in her arms. "Some," she said. "And eggs. You in town for supplies?" "Mostly." "Doc stitched up a ranch hand of mine this morning. Thought I'd stop off before heading back upriver." Grace stood between them, squinting up at him. "You find any lilacs?" Callum crouched, pulling something from his jacket pocket. A carved wooden button shaped like a small blossom. "Closest I could do this time of year," he said. "But it's for you." Grace reached out carefully, fingers brushing the smooth wood. "It's perfect." Georgia's brow lifted, but she said nothing. He rose. "I was hoping to find you here. I'd like to call again. Not today, don't want to presume too much, but soon." Georgia looked at her daughter, then back at him. "We're not far." "You know the ridge past the split cedar?" "I do," she nodded once. "Then you'll find us." He tipped his hat. "I will." 2 days passed before he came again. Late afternoon, with the sun slanting gold through the cottonwoods and the air thick with the smell of wind-dried grass. Georgia was chopping kindling when she heard the hoofbeats. Grace was up in the loft with slate and chalk, practicing her letters. Callum dismounted quietly, tying his horse near the porch. He didn't speak right away. Just watched her split the last log, steady and sure. "I brought some seed potatoes," he said finally. "Figured you might want to set a few rows early next spring." She rested the axe against the stump. "That's a long time from now." "I plan to be around." Georgia wiped her hands. "You always bring gifts, not always. Just when I mean something by them." She stepped onto the porch, leaned against one of the posts. "And what do you mean by this one?" "That I know what it takes to stay." The words hung there a moment, caught in the hush between wind gusts. She studied him, the set of his shoulders, the way he didn't shift or avert his gaze. "You think you want to stay," she said. "But staying looks different when the snow sets in and the firewood runs low and nothing's easy." "I've had winters like that," he said. "And I've stayed through worse." She folded her arms, not in defense but in thought. "You're not what I expected. I get that a lot. Still," she said, "you're here." "I am." Behind them, Grace called from the loft. "Mama, can he stay for supper?" Georgia didn't look away from him. "You hungry?" "I could eat," he said. She pushed the door open. "Then come inside." And as dusk pulled its long shadows across the yard, the three of them sat together at the small table, Grace with her button tucked into her pocket, Callum with dust still on his boots, and Georgia with a quiet in her chest that, for the first time in a long while, didn't ache. The first snow came in the middle of November, soft and heavy, covering the split rail fence and the bare field beyond like a blessing. Georgia stood on the porch with her shawl drawn tight, watching Grace press tracks into the white with her boots. A pine branch above had bent low under the weight, needles glazed with frost. Callum had come every Sunday since the dance. He never stayed past dusk, and he never arrived without something useful: a length of rope, a spare tin of lard, a jar of chokecherry preserves. Georgia hadn't asked for any of it, and he never made it feel like a favor. He'd help split wood, or check the roofline, or sit with Grace while she worked through her arithmetic. He knew how to hold silence without making it awkward. That counted more than she could say. Today he'd arrived on horseback just after noon. Grace had waved so hard she nearly tipped the stew pot from its hook. He tied his horse beside the barn and knocked once, even though the door was already open. Georgia had met him at the threshold with a wool coat draped over one arm. "You'll need this come evening," she said. He accepted it. "You been sewing?" "Just mending. Found it in the trunk upstairs. Was my brother's before he went east." Callum turned the coat in his hands. "You sure? It's too broad in the shoulder for anyone else." He nodded once, folding it over his arm. "I'll take care of it." Now, as the snow deepened, they sat across from each other near the hearth. Grace had fallen asleep on the rug, cheeks pink from the cold, her small hands tucked beneath her chin. The stewpot simmered low, and the fire cast a long orange glow across Callum's face. "You were serious about staying," Georgia said, not as a question. "I was," he replied, voice low. "So what does that mean?" "In practice," Callum leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Means I want to build something that lasts. Doesn't have to be quick, doesn't have to be easy, but it has to be real." She watched the fire a moment. I haven't known real for a long time. I can wait, he said. But I won't lie to you, I want more than Sunday afternoons. She looked at him then. You ever been married? He shook his head. Nearly once. She wanted Kansas. I didn't. Doesn't sound like it ended bitter. No. Just ended. Georgia pulled the shawl tighter. I don't know how to be with someone who doesn't leave. Then let me show you. Her breath caught sharp in her chest, but she didn't look away. Why us? Why now? He glanced toward Grace, then back. Because you didn't flinch when things were quiet. Because I've watched the way you listen. Because I feel more myself near this table than I do on 1,000 acres of open range. The warmth in the room thickened, not from the fire, but from something steadier. She stood and crossed to the window, fingers brushing the glass. Snow fell heavier now, blanketing the trail in both directions. You'll have to stay the night, she said. Road won't be passable by dusk. He rose slowly. If you're sure. I am. He didn't move toward her, didn't touch her, just waited. She turned, arms folded. There's quilts in the loft. You'll have to take the straw tick. I've slept colder places. She nodded once. Then we'll have breakfast at light. He gave a small, grateful bow of the head. That night, after the fire dimmed and Grace had been carried up to the bed in the eaves, Georgia sat alone at the kitchen table, turning the wooden soup spoon over in her hands. Outside, the wind had settled. The snow would hold through morning. Upstairs, she heard the creak of the loft boards as Callum laid down the extra quilt and settled onto the mattress. He didn't make a sound beyond that. She set the spoon down gently, rose and bolted the door. For the first time in years, she didn't dread morning. The next morning broke with a sky the color of pewter glass, pale behind the mist hanging like breath over the fields. The snow hadn't deepened much overnight, but it had hardened at the edges, crisp beneath the soles of boots. Georgia stepped outside with a kettle in hand, the steam rising like a veil around her face. She walked slowly, listening for the crunch of hooves or the rattle of wagon wheels. There was none, just the hush of winter settling its weight across the land. Back inside, Callum was already feeding the stove, sleeves rolled and hair still damp from melted snow. He kept his movements quiet, careful not to wake Grace, who had taken to the loft before dawn to escape the cold in the main room. You're up early, Georgia said, closing the door behind her. He nodded, didn't sleep long. She didn't ask why. Instead, she moved to the cupboard, took out 2 mugs and poured the coffee without a word. When she passed him one, his fingers brushed hers rough from rope work, warm from the fire. He took a slow sip, then glanced toward the window. Storm'll hold off a while. I can help you haul water before I go. She leaned against the counter, watching him. You planning to ride out today? I need to check on the cattle, but I'll be back before the weekend. She studied his face, the calm in it. You always keep a schedule like that. He rested his mug on the table. Used to ride fence lines from sunup to dark. Then I started carving out time I cared about. Georgia didn't speak for a moment. Then, you ever think about selling off? Callum shook his head. Land's lean, but it's mine. I'll hold it as long as I breathe. You work it alone, he paused. Couple hands off and on, but when it's just me, it's quieter. She folded her arms. And you don't mind the quiet. I mind the wrong kind of quiet. He looked at her. The kind where it feels like you're waiting on something that never shows. Her jaw tightened slightly, but her voice was even. I lived in that kind a long time, he nodded. Not this winter. The words settled between them, simple and unadorned. Georgia didn't answer. Instead, she moved to the root cellar door and pulled it open, revealing 2 bushels of carrots and a hanging string of onions. She gestured with her chin. You carry one up, I'll take the other. They worked side by side after that, no talk, just the rhythm of shared labor. The kind that made sense in the body. When the woodpile was stacked fuller and the water buckets were brimming at the corner of the lean-to, They returned inside, cheeks raw from wind, hands red with cold. Grace had woken up and was sitting cross-legged on the floor, drawing a picture in the ash dust with a stick of charcoal. She looked up when they entered, her braid half loose and her feet bare beneath her dress. "Can he stay for supper again?" she asked, eyes bright. Callum crouched beside her. "You planning to make a feast? I can peel potatoes," she said proudly. Georgia gathered her shawl from the peg. "If he's here by sundown, he can have whatever we're eating." He stood, catching her gaze. "Then I'll be back before the light fades." She stepped closer, voice low. "If you mean to keep showing up, you need to understand something. I'm listening. I don't take kindness lightly, and I don't let my daughter get attached to someone who won't stay the winter." Callum's voice was quiet. "I've seen enough winters to know where I belong." Georgia searched his face, waiting for doubt. There was none. She nodded once. "Then I'll expect you by supper." Callum didn't smile, just touched the brim of his hat as he stepped out into the cold. As the door closed behind him, Georgia turned back to Grace, who was now drawing a tree with long, reaching branches. "Why a tree?" she asked. Grace looked up. "Because it stays in one place, even when it storms." Georgia's throat tightened, but she only said, "Put on your boots. We've got bread to bake." The stove crackled low with hickory and pine, throwing a steady warmth across the kitchen floor as Georgia braided dough beside the hearth. Grace sat at the table with her slate, tongue poked in concentration as she copied letters from a primer. Outside, the light had shifted in a way Georgia knew meant Callum would return soon if he hadn't turned back. She didn't look toward the window. Didn't need to. She knew the weight of waiting too well to let it show. When the first knock came, it was firm and brief. Georgia wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door. Callum stood with his hat in one hand, his coat dusted with snow and a burlap sack slung across one shoulder. "I passed 2 does bedded near your fence line," he said. "Might be worth setting snares." She stepped back to let him in, closing the door behind him. "You're early." He set the sack down gently near the shelf. "I said I would be." Grace looked up from her slate. "Did you bring anything?" Callum crouched by the bag and unwrapped a small parcel tied with twine. "Found these near the riverbank. Birch bark curls. You can draw on them if you dry them right." Grace took the bundle with both hands, her eyes wide. "Will they last?" "They'll hold through the winter." Georgia returned to her dough. "You're not just trying to impress her, are you?" Callum met her eyes. "I don't try. I do what I mean to." She pressed the braid into a tin and set it near the stove to rise. "That kind of certainty's dangerous if you're wrong." "I've been wrong before," he said. "But not now." They ate by lamplight, the bread warm and coarse, the soup seasoned with wild onion and salt pork. Grace nodded off midway through her second bowl, and Georgia carried her to the cot near the stove, brushing a blanket over her shoulders. As she turned back, Callum was watching her, elbows resting on his knees. "You've done all this without help," he said. "Longer than most could manage. I didn't have a choice. You have one now." Georgia sat across from him. The firelight caught the edge of her cheekbone, the slope of her collar. "You want to marry me?" "I do." She didn't answer right away. The quiet in the room grew slow and full. "You don't know everything about me," she said finally. "I know enough to want the rest. You don't know how I wake sometimes, thinking he might still come back. Not because I want him to, but because that's how long grief takes." Callum's voice was low. "I won't ask you to forget anything. I'll just ask that you make room." She looked at his hands, broad, calloused still. "You have land enough for 3. I've already cleared a space for a second cabin. Wasn't sure if I'd ever use it." Georgia leaned back, the fire warming her spine. "I don't want promises. I want proof." "Then come with me," he said. "Both of you, stay through spring. If it's not right, we'll come back. But if it is," she didn't let him finish. Grace has never had a real home. She'll have one. Georgia reached across the table, touching her fingers to his. All right. The snow kept falling through the night, piling soft against the windowsills and fence posts while the fire burned low. Georgia banked the coals and Callum unrolled his bedroll by the hearth. She didn't go upstairs. Instead, she brought her quilt down beside him, not touching, not speaking, just letting the space between them narrow until it was gone. They left the ridge 2 mornings later, the wagon loaded with flour, blankets, and all they could carry. Grace sat between them on the bench, her hair tucked into a wool scarf, her charcoal drawings bundled in a pocket. The trail was slow, but the sky was clear. Callum's land lay 5 miles northwest, tucked along the bank of a narrow creek that ran even in winter. The cabin had a roof that held, a smokehouse already half full, and a barn with room for 2 milk goats and a span of oxen. Georgia stepped inside the cabin and saw the table already set with 3 chairs. She looked back at him. "You've been ready a long time. I was waiting on the right reason." That spring, they planted potatoes behind the cabin and onions near the fence line. Grace started school 2 miles downriver, riding a mule Callum had trained for her. Georgia kept hens again, and Callum built her a porch that faced the sunset. She taught him how to bake bread without burning the edges. He taught her how to shoot a hawk from a fence post if it came too near the coop. They married in early June, under the cottonwood tree near the creek. Her dress was blue calico, and his hands didn't shake. Grace stood between them with a crown of wildflowers in her hair. At night, when the wind moved through the pines, they lay in silence, not because they lacked words, but because the quiet no longer asked anything from them. Georgia had once thought peace was a thing buried with the dead. But now, as she traced the edge of Callum's hand with hers, she saw it wasn't gone. It had just taken a long time finding its way back.